I am Jeff Bleich, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sheila Smith, tonight's guest. Sheila Smith is an expert on Japanese politics and foreign policy. She's a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and her current research focuses on how geostrategic change in Asia is affecting the strategic choices of Asian countries and the U.S. Dr. Smith joined CFR from the East-West Center in Hawaii in 2007. So you gave up Hawaii for New York. So this is how dedicated you are to your craft. And she currently teaches as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She earned her MA and PhD degrees in political science at Columbia University. And most germane to tonight, she is the author of a recently released book, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China. So please join me in welcoming Sheila Smith for a conversation on the policy issues that China's rise has produced in the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly the strategic choices it is creating for the leadership within Japan today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I love the title of your book, Intimate Rivals, because to the U.S., when we think about China's rise, we think about it with a certain amount of distance, a sense of, well, this will be interesting, and how will this affect various features? But there is some time and space for the United States, whereas in Japan, it's affecting everything. It affects the food that's being eaten in Japan. It's affecting who gets elected in Japan. It affects their sense of maritime security and national security, and with the longstanding historical animosities between China and Japan, it elicits a lot of emotion that we just don't feel here. So, what was your focus when you first picked the title and when you picked the subject?
Thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Jeff, for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I came down from Seattle, and so I looked out at the Pacific with all of the ships obviously destined for Asia, and understand that when you're sitting in the Beltway, these are kind of abstract, esoteric conversations, but they're really not over here. And so I've been looking forward to the conversation with you, and thank you. The choice of Intimate Rivals as a title, I think you've summed up really nicely for me, because it's clearly true that when you look out at Asia today, Japan and China are not cooperating. They see themselves as, in some ways, mirror images of each other. And you can look back a century or more, where Japan's rise in the 19th century was really reflected off of the Chinese experience with Western expansion into Asia. And again, in the 1970s or so, when Deng Xiaoping decided to move in the direction of market reforms, many Chinese leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, no less, looked to Japan as a successful example of modernization, industrialization, and very much a model in some respects on the economic side of things. But I think the rivalry is clear. You've never had an Asia-Pacific where both China and Japan are powerful countries. One country has risen, the other has declined. One has declined, the other has risen. So I think this piece of rivalry is not something we think about today in the 21st century for those two countries. And it may be a benign rivalry, we don't know yet, but I wanted to get at the intimacy, and I think you described it very well: cultural intimacy, historical intimacy, economic intimacy of the two societies, but also understand that it's pitted with this other facet of the relationship. I began to do the research for this project. You will know that I'm a true academic when I say this, over a decade ago. This is not a topic I picked up last year or the year before. But in the early 2000s, those of us who knew Japan well and spent time in Tokyo, thought about Japanese foreign policy, we understood that there was a growing, almost palpable sense of not confusion, but somewhat discontent about the way in which Beijing and Tokyo were handling their relationship. Prime Minister Koizumi, we talked about them before we came on stage, had insisted again on visiting the controversial Yasukuni Shrine. It raised yet again this question of war memory in the two countries' relations. But beyond that, you could feel trade tensions. China and Japan were having their first trade disputes over shiitake mushrooms and tatami mats, things like that, things that they hadn't really had friction over in the past. And of course, the East China Sea became a focal point of contention as well.
Yeah.
So I began this because I was kind of curious about how the two countries, why were they having trouble? Why were they beginning to be unable to solve practical problems together? Not the war memory issues, but these practical issues. And also I could sense that it went beyond the diplomats, that there was a growing sense in Japanese society that China posed some challenges to the way the Japanese had perceived themselves in Asia.
Yeah. Now, in 2006, though, when you started the research on this book, that was a period where I recall there was a movement towards reconciliation. There were some high-level meetings between Japan and China, and it seemed as though there was a real effort between the two countries to avoid the zero-sum realities that they'd had in the past, where one's rise meant the other's decline. And yet what's happened over the last 9 years that has moved us away from that into a much more fraught relationship between Japan and China?
Well, again, I think the assumption was that Mr. Koizumi and his insistence on going to Yasukuni was the cause of the problem, right? Even the Chinese gave him a lot of credit for what they called the chill in the relationship, the freeze between Japan and China. But the causality went far beyond the personality at the head. It really went far beyond Mr. Koizumi himself. And I think what you see in the decades since then, as you pointed out, he left office. Mr. Abe, the current prime minister, right, in his first time in office as prime minister, he came in. He had the same ideological predisposition that he has today. He was not a different person in 2006 than he is today. But he came into office, and he was the first Japanese prime minister to visit Seoul and Beijing before coming to Washington. So there was a blueprint that the diplomats on both sides, Chinese and Japanese diplomats, had really prepared, getting ready for Mr. Koizumi to step back and the next person to come in. And that next person was Mr. Abe. So he implemented a very sophisticated blueprint between 2006 and 2008. He went to Seoul and then Beijing, and then others came to, Chinese leaders then came back and forth. Wen Jiabao, several times, came back to Tokyo. In fact, Wen Jiabao gave one of the most evocative speeches in the Japanese parliament I've heard any foreign leader ever give, in terms of tapping into the Japanese sense of themselves and their sense of that relationship, partnership with China. So 2 years in the making, this high-level summitry back and forth, and you finally, in 2008, get the Fukuda summit. And that was Fukuda Yasuo, for those of you who follow Japanese politics. His father was the man who signed the treaty, the peace treaty between Japan and China. He had a real legacy of being very close to China. But in that meeting, they also concluded an agreement on joint energy exploration in the East China Sea. They dealt with the food security issue that I write about in my book. It was a really positive, very warm meeting. And then who goes back to China, and within hours, the Sichuan earthquake occurs. And very quickly, Mr. Fukuda prepared a response, including the offer of a Japanese self-defense force airlift to Sichuan. Hu Jintao, having just come out of Tokyo, accepts that, with the exception of getting boots on the ground, so to speak, of Japanese military in Sichuan. But nonetheless, the Japanese disaster relief team was the first foreign team on the ground, the first time ever in China. So you see that it matters. These high-level diplomatic relationships mattered. The very carefully choreographed effort at reconciliation mattered.
Is that one of the challenges then? Because between, say, 2006 and the present, I think there would have been 8 prime ministers, if you count Abe as 2, Prime Minister Abe. So whereas China has these long presidencies, 10-year terms, long-term plans. If the high-level relationships matter so much, has that been one of the challenges over the last decade?
I think it has. I don't think it's necessarily the cause, but it certainly gets in the way of the ability to get back to reconciliation when something goes wrong. So the Chinese shift to a fifth-generation leadership to Xi Jinping took some time. The consolidation of Xi's time in power took a couple of years. Yep. Some people think it's still ongoing today. Most China watchers think he's pretty much consolidated his grip on power. But you'll see in the last, let's say from 2010, from the time a Chinese fishing trawler rams a couple of Japanese Coast Guard ships, from that point forward, the Japanese governments were having a hard time, even people like Fukuda, who had friends on the other side, who was very well known to Chinese Communist Party leaders, they had a difficult time making a connection in China because China itself was going through this transition. As you point out, Japan too had this shift in leadership, right? Annually, they had new people at the helm, but they also in 2009 had a new political party for the first time that came to power. And I think in many ways, when you look at the two crises, both 2010, that trawler incident, and then again in 2012, when the Japanese decide to purchase the islands, right, from their private owner, you see a party that's not used to diplomacy, that doesn't have direct ties, personal or otherwise, to Beijing, really fumbling a little bit to how to move reconciliation forward.
Yeah. Well, your book talks about specific areas in which there is tension and how it's being resolved and what it says about the long-term prospects for the relationship. And one of them that you focused on is this maritime security and competing claims in the East China Sea, but also how competing claims in the South China Sea cause Japan to worry about how their own disputed claims will be resolved. So why don't we talk a little bit about those? Because they really, whenever people listen to KQED, what they want to know is, so how does it affect the U.S.? We tend to be very U.S.-centric. So there are a couple of issues here. One is, what are our responsibilities under our alliance treaty with Japan, because Article 5 says that we will defend areas that are administered by Japan, and the Senkaku Islands are administered by Japan. So what does that mean in terms of a conflict there? And then secondly, what does it say about the relationship between Japan and China that there has not been any satisfactory resolution over the last 7 years since that first fishing vessel started bumping up against others?
So what does it have to do with the United States? Very quickly, the alliance, of course, commits us to the defense of Japan. We have a bilateral security treaty, and two articles are important. One is Article 5, which is the U.S. commitment to the defense of Japan, and Article 6 is the Japanese offering of facilities and bases to the United States military to maintain stability in what was called the Far East. Remember, the treaty was revised and concluded as it currently stands in 1960. So it's a Cold War context within which the Japanese and U.S. planners were thinking. But we do have a commitment. On the islands, the American policy, the official policy, and I'm going to sound a little bit like the State Department here, so forgive me. But first, we take no position on the sovereignty of the disputed islands. And remember, we occupied, or we controlled, the administration of those islands up until Okinawa was given back to the Japanese in 1972. So whereas most of Japan regained its sovereignty from the United States in 1952, Okinawa, the southernmost islands, including those islands that China and Taiwan dispute, they were under the administrative control of the United States. So when we reverted control to Japan, we reverted sovereignty to Japan. Taiwan, in fact, was the first country, not mainland China, but Taiwan was the first country to protest, to say, wait a minute, those islands, the Diaoyu, according to the Chinese, Diaoyu Dao, according to the Taiwanese, those islands are not Japanese, and we should have them. So the dispute has existed since the 70s, right? And we had a role in that process. But what we did then is say, fine, but we don't take a position on the sovereignty. Clearly, Taiwan and China have a claim. We can't say who's right or wrong. It's up to the three parties to decide. But we do have a treaty that says we will defend any territory under the administration of Japan. So that way the Senkakus are included in that Article 5 protection. But quietly over the years, the U.S. government has tried to urge that it doesn't become inflamed. This doesn't become an issue that the two countries worry about. Today, however, all the way up to the president. Last year, President Obama went to Tokyo. He reiterated the U.S. policy that islands under the administration of Japan would be protected by Article 5 of the bilateral treaty. In addition, he said, and our Senate has said it as well, and this is in the wake of those incidents, right, that we will not accept any attempt at coercion or any attempt to claim administrative authority. In other words, we don't accept the fact that although the Chinese are patrolling those islands, we don't accept that as their administrative control over the islands.
Well, it seems as though you've got two very different perspectives, and it explains the challenge that you describe in the book, which is in Japan, there is a sense of there may be some question about the ultimate sovereignty, and we can work that out in a number of different ways. The one way that we can't work it out is if you just start using ships and moving into the region, or take other radical steps, such as cutting off the sale of rare earths to Japan, which is another action taken by China during this period. I think China's point of view was when we were in a weakened position, you took advantage of us and gained control of this. Then you did this purchase from the owners, and we are not in the same position we were in back in 1978. We're a more significant country, and we're entitled to respect and a different approach. And so you've got two different, diametrically different perspectives on what is happening here. How do you see this getting resolved?
Well, I write about this a little bit in the book. If you go back to the time when the treaty was negotiated, there was in the final stages a little bit of tension over these islands, even though they're teeny tiny, and there were many, many other issues that Beijing and Tokyo really wanted to talk about in terms of normalizing their relationship. But hundreds of Chinese fishing vessels appeared off the coast of these islands. It became a little bit of an issue. The Deng Xiaoping later went to Tokyo to ratify the treaty and said, let's leave it to the next generation. Let's set it aside. Let's shelve the issue. Japanese diplomats didn't use that formula. They basically said, well, those are our islands, but yes, let's set it aside. They didn't use the word set aside, but they just basically said, okay, the island issue has receded yet again into the background of the relationship. I think until you get into the 2000s, and this is the piece of the puzzle that's important to remember, when you're thinking about the way the influences, the various influences, they're not just strategic, they're economic and other influences, they're emanating from this rising new power in Asia, right? Is that there's citizens attached to that rising power, right? So a lot of the tensions that you see emerging over the islands were not driven by the governments. They were not driven by, let me claim back my territory from you that was taken 100 years ago. They were really citizens getting in boats, going across the East China Sea, very choppy, rough waters, and planting flags. And up until the 2000s, rather, these kinds of activities were quietly managed by both governments. Right? It didn't matter that it was conservatives in Japan or the Communist Party in Beijing. They kind of quietly toned it down and sent people home again. But when you get into the 2000s, the media gets a little bit of a picture. The publics on both sides get a little bit more engaged in the issue. You get a little bit more of the popular sentiment, the territorial aspirations, both in practice and in theory, right? The aspirations of a rising China. And the Japanese pushback, frankly. The Japanese public is no less susceptible to nationalism, as we know. But it becomes a much more popular issue than a quietly managed government issue. And today, you've got coast guards of both countries circling the islands. You've got navies and air forces of both countries across the East China Sea. The East China Sea used to be fairly quiet, fishermen, coast guards, but today you've got major military powers, including the North Koreans, if you want to look a little north, but you've got the major emerging country navies and air forces really coming into contact with each other. And now this territorial dispute has taken on a far different dimension.
Yeah.
So the solutions are, for the alliance, the solutions are deterrence. The United States has been very clear that it will act in concert with Japan to defend Japan, as the treaty commitments suggest. But there's also been a lot of quiet dialogue with Beijing by Washington, and now increasingly by Tokyo. They've opened up a direct conversation about risk reduction in the East China Sea. So that's the positive side of the story. We've been talking a little bit of the negative side only, but there are positive signs of late that they may be able to tone it back down again.
Yeah. Now, arguably, this situation affects who gets elected in Japan and how long they get to serve. So, as we talked about, there was quite a bit of turnover in the Prime Minister's chair, and now there is a relative period of stability. He's been reelected after calling an early election, and there are different ways of viewing his reelection. One is that it is related to this notion that we need a strong leader with a somewhat nationalist perspective who will be prepared to go toe-to-toe or eye-to-eye with China. Another point of view is simply that he represented Abenomics, and it's more of a domestic economic element. What do you think?
I think in the overall electoral, the reason for the election of Abe Shinzo and the return of the LDP to power, because remember, Japan is a parliamentary system. It's as much a story about the return of the LDP as it is about Abe himself. But I think my view is it's the latter. Yeah. It's a little bit of a combination. It's not a China vote, but it's a desire for stability. Right, back to stable, manageable government. Remember that it's not just the rise of China that's happening in the last 5 or 6 years, it's also the triple disasters of 2011. The shock of those disasters for the Japanese public was very high, and the recovery from that disaster is also very complex and very difficult. Yeah. So stable government was important, and so too was Abenomics. So too was this economic recovery that most Japanese felt that they just were getting no traction out of their government on that side of the policy agenda.
But even if his election is based principally on approval of his economic policies, the question is whether he's going to read it entirely that way or whether he will use that mandate for other purposes. Because one aspect of the Abe regime has been to look for ways to expand the military strength of Japan, increasing its military budget, and also looking to reduce some of the restrictions that have existed constitutionally on Japan in terms of acting beyond its mere self-defense, but in defense of its allies.
So the Japanese defense budget for the last decade has had negative growth.
Yeah.
For a decade now or more. And yet you're looking at a strategic environment in which you've got the proliferation of both missiles and nuclear capability in North Korea. And you've also now got this expansion of the Chinese maritime capability and broader capabilities, cyberspace, et cetera, in the region. The island dispute, though, I think was a real kind of focal point on China because for the first time, I think, despite the tensions that I outlined in the book about all these other issues, the island dispute really raised the specter that, oh my gosh, this actually could be an militarily adversarial relationship. And I think until you get to that point, few Japanese would have thought that their country would be in direct military confrontation with China. So you do have the China factor in the backdrop. I think it's also true to say Mr. Abe, when he was in power in 2006, 2007, he did raise this question of reinterpreting what the Japanese refer to as the right of collective self-defense. And that right was really articulated in the country in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese people want their military to defend them, that they're called the self-defense force for a reason, right? The Constitution prescribes the use of force for settling disputes, and the Japanese are very comfortable with that, the Japanese public. But I think many of the strategic planners in Japan thought that the Japanese military ought to work more closely with us, that we have an alliance with the United States, but our military cannot operate beyond the very narrow definition of self-defense. So we've got a pretty big consensus, not just Mr. Abe, but across the strategic planning community that we ought to be able to fight alongside the U.S. military if the U.S. military is forward deployed to defend us. But he does have the political momentum, as you said. He's got a 2/3 majority in the lower house. You'll see he had a snap election last December in which he had a little bit less voter turnout, a little less enthusiasm, but nonetheless sustained his party's 2/3 majority, his coalition's 2/3 majority, at least perhaps until 2018. And there'll be a second election next summer in the upper house. And herein lies something to watch for, and that is, Mr. Abe has always been a strong advocate of the revision of the Japanese Constitution. Yeah. So not just for the military, but this idea of really putting a stop to this post-war Japan, to undoing, if you will, or moving forward the post-war settlement so that the Japanese people can have their own voice in their constitution. And next year's election, the upper house election, potentially could bring a 2/3 majority sympathetic to Mr. Abe and his party. And so you may very well, if you get that outcome next year, you could see a fairly broad-based debate in Japan about their constitution and about their future.
Yeah. And so while it may be that the Japanese people would be inclined to go with a normalization of Japan, make it more of a normal country as opposed to a post-war country, and also a desire to support the economic policies. There is a concern within the Japanese population about China and a bit of a hostility, maybe not one that seeks a confrontation, but hostility. One of the polls you cite in your book is that 93% of the Japanese have a negative view of China. And so that, combined with some nationalist leadership, seems like a recipe for, it seems like a risky venture. That's a genie that's hard to put back in the bottle once nationalism gets free. Is that a concern for China?
I think it should be. I don't know whether it actually is or not, although you hear a lot of commentary by Xinhua and other media, as well as some of the people that we meet in Washington. They quite easily say that Mr. Abe, the nationalist, has led Japan down this militaristic path, but they're less willing to acknowledge what we point out a little bit to them, which is that in many cases, some of this nationalism was given a lot more political space in Japan because of the island dispute, because of some of the ways in which China has responded to Japan. So China very much has a lot of influence over the future direction, I think, of the Japanese. And I think the more that the two governments can begin to recognize that solving their problems together, cooperating and demonstrating the effectiveness of that cooperation, the less their publics will be sensitive and less their publics will want to be more confrontational with China. I do think analytically, if we could take a step back, especially for Americans thinking about why would this matter to me, right, is we have this very shorthand way of thinking of China's rise, right? There's a power over there, it's on the other side of the sea, it's getting stronger. But the reality is the way in which this geostrategic shift is going on in Asia is it's affecting the domestic politics of countries as well. It's affecting the way in which the people of Japan, for example, are asking new questions and demanding new protections of their government. So government capacity and not just nationalism, but government capacity to answer some of these claims of protection is going to be very, very important for the Asian countries going forward.
Yeah. Well, that actually rolls into a question we received from an audience member, which is, what is the importance of these islands? Why are these two countries focused on two uninhabited pieces of rock out in the middle of the sea? Is it an economic interest? Do they think there are mineral rights within the area around it that's driving them forward? Is it a belief that one day they may want to populate them, and is it more of a military thing, or is it just a sense of historic pride, or is it just, we want to let you know what we can do now?
All of the above.
Okay.
So there's no one answer. So the islands themselves have not been inhabited since the 1930s, maybe late 20s, early 1930s. And the people that lived, there were a couple of hundred people there on a factory for bonito, right? For katsuobushi, for those of you who have familiarity with Japanese cooking. And also guano. Guano was a big fertilizer. Guano's seagull poop, right? It got actually exported all the way to Europe from those little
Can
tiny
we say
islands.
poop on KQED?
I don't know. Are we allowed to say that? I don't know what the polite word is.
Yeah, well, we've got a 5-second delay.
Droppings, let's see. I thought California was very relaxed.
Yes.
Maybe not. So anyway, but those are the products of the 19th century and early 20th century, right? These are not products that everybody's hankering to go to war over today, right? And there's nobody there. There's no fresh water.
The guano wars.
The guano wars,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Well, I was just up in the San Juan Islands. They had a pig war. But today, I think there are two things involved that are important. One is that islands matter in demarcating exclusive economic zones. So under the UN law of the sea today, islands, and especially these islands in Asia, take on a new significance. If you have sovereignty over a little reef or an island, you can begin to advocate that your exclusive economic zone can be demarcated from those islands themselves. So it's not just the sovereignty of the islands, it's the way in which you interpret your expanded maritime claim, and that is a resource conception, right? So that's important. But there's little island disputes all over Asia, and you mentioned the South China Seas, which is a huge focal point today of Chinese behavior, but also many, many disputed claims over those islands. The question becomes how you solve the disputes over the islands.
Yeah.
Right? And do you use force? Do you reclaim territory and plant your flag and say, I have it, I have effective control, therefore you can't get me out? And that is going to become more and more pressure. That's more and more the question for Asia. All countries, all claimants are going to begin to take islands in the interest because they can't get peaceful resolution of these disputes.
And that would probably be the U.S. interest in this. We don't have a great concern about guano supply and or have a claim on the islands.
Right.
What we do care about, though, is how these powers, as the demographic shift, as wealth shift, as the economic center of gravity moves
Right.
more towards China, how are they going to resolve the inevitable frictions that occur? Are they going to use arbitrations and agreements and treaties? Are they going to have joint development arrangements, or are they going to have ships bumping into each other in trade wars over essential commodities?
And I imagine most Americans watch CNN occasionally, right? And so you'll probably have seen the CNN reporter that was on the U.S. Navy aircraft that was flying over the South China Sea and showing exactly what is going on in these remote areas. And not everybody lives over there. Nobody lives over there. Very few people do. But now I think the trick is to enhance what the people inside the Beltway call maritime domain awareness, which basically means making sure that we have the capacity to see what happens on and in and around our seas. And that has civilian importance as much as it has military importance.
Yeah. Now, people inside the Beltway love to focus on the military pieces, but there are whole other
Huge
enormous
yep.
dimensions to this relationship. Let's talk a little bit about food safety.
Right.
Over the last few years, China has become a critical supplier of the basic food staples of Japan. And so Japan is more and more dependent on China, and not just as a trade partner, and they've had deep and strong economic ties, but now for their basic nutrition. And there's concern about the regulatory environment in China. How is that playing out in terms of the relationship between the two countries?
Well, one of the 4 case studies in my book is exactly about this question of the Japanese dependence on Chinese production of food in China. So it's not just the vegetables and the shiitake mushrooms and the imports of agricultural goods from China. It's also the fact that most Japanese food producers, processors, now have joint ventures with Chinese companies in China. And so one of the great moments where the Japanese public was deeply shocked by Chinese influence on their daily choices was this question of food coming from China. And it was a Japanese company who had frozen gyoza, dumplings, and it was it was a basic household decision to have your kids have these gyoza, and they thought they were Japanese produced and therefore they were made in Japan. Well, it turns out they were a Japanese company that was making them, but they were made in northern China, and they had been poisoned, deliberately poisoned. And so the chapter goes on to explore the degree of interdependence now in terms of Japan's food supply and the lack of regulatory oversight. And this is not something that you have to assume that there's a hostile China, or even the act of poisoning those dumplings was not somebody who was trying to, this was not an anti-Japan act.
He was a disgruntled employee.
He was a disgruntled employee of his Chinese company's joint venture with the Japanese, and he was trying to get attention and get better pay and maternity leave for his wife. So labor disputes in China matter. So when you have this level of interdependence, right, in production, there's a whole host of regulatory ways in which you have to develop capacities sufficient to ensure food safety, for example. Yeah. So that chapter is really about the vulnerabilities of interdependence as much as how interdependence can secure the two countries in a more cooperative path.
Yeah. Now, the trade balance and trade between the two countries is becoming a significant issue in other ways. China is now, China in the last few years surpassed Japan in terms of GDP and went from being the number 3 economy in the world to number 2. How did Japan react to that? How did its leadership, how did the people of Japan feel? Even though their per capita income has remained substantially higher, their GDP has now fallen behind China.
So that's true. Households in Japan are wealthier than Chinese households. That's clear. But that number, when you slip from being number 2 in the global economy to being number 3, and you're surpassed by the country that you just began giving overseas development assistance to in 1978, it was a shock. Frankly, it was just one of those very deep impressionistic moments that, China's rise means that we're going to fall lower. I mean, basically, we were being butted out of the way. But I think if you look at the actual economic relationship between the two countries, that's a little deceptive. The symbols matter, but it's a little deceptive. The Japanese and Chinese economies are deeply interdependent. 370 last year, 370 to 375 billion dollars annually in trade between the two countries.
Yeah.
We are in the 570 billion mark, so we have bigger in absolute terms. We have a larger amount of trade with China, but nonetheless, Japan is not insignificant. But where it really matters to China is in Japan's foreign direct investment. It's the highest behind, if you count Hong Kong separately, then it's number 3. But if you just think about Taiwan as being the biggest investor, source of foreign direct investment in China, Japan is second to that. So Japan's rate of investment has slowed, like many other countries. They are seeing less opportunity in China because of wage increases, because of some of the political risk, perhaps. But Japan is still has a very large appetite for foreign direct investment and production of consumer goods in China.
Yeah, well, and investment, unlike trade, tends to be more about trust.
Right.
It's about a long-term, I'm betting on you. I'm betting on this country. And so does that suggest that there is not just, a modest cooling off of the China's economy, but more related to trust?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's hard to tell because the Chinese economy is changing, and everybody here who probably interacts with China, that 7% growth now as opposed to 10% a few years ago. It's a huge difference in how you perceive the interaction with China or what the opportunities are in China. So, the trade number that I gave you has never dipped. It's been a steady increase all the way up, even through all of these political tensions. So you haven't had trade embargoes or massive dislocations of the trade behavior. You just haven't seen that on either side, right? Despite the rare earths moment of that unofficial embargo. The foreign direct investment is still too hard to tease out, I think. Analytically, there's been ups and downs. And last year, in 2014, it dropped significantly. But it was the rate of growth of foreign direct investment that dropped, not the absolute amount of foreign direct investment. So again, it's hard to tease out what is political risk. In other words, what is a result of the behavior, the political behaviors, and what is really the changing China market. I think we'll need a few more years, a little bit better trend line to analyze before we can really answer that question.
Now, how has this rivalry affected foreign aid? Because you had mentioned that Japan had been a substantial provider of aid to China and other nations as well. Obviously, as China grows wealthier, it depends less on that, but there is still tremendous poverty in China. How is this affecting?
Well, it surprises everybody, but Japan's overseas direct development assistance, overseas development assistance to China only ended in 2008, but it has ended. So the official program began in 1978. In the early years, and I have the statistics for you in the book if you're interested, it tracked very closely to the 5-year plans that the Chinese Communist Party developed. There was massive Japanese ingestion of capital and loans. A lot of grant aid at the beginning, then increasingly more loan assistance. Today, it's largely the private sectors that conduct the economic relationship. There is no development assistance anymore. But at that visit between Hu Jintao and Prime Minister Fukuda, who thanked the Japanese people for helping to rebuild China. And large segments of that aid was dedicated to infrastructure building in China. So if you travel in China these days, you'll see plaques along major thoroughfares and highways, ports, all kinds of facilities that were built with the assistance of Japanese overseas development assistance.
Now, on the issue of trade, we are in the final painful throes of congressional consideration of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 12-country trade agreement that includes Japan as one of the key partners. And the economies, the 12 economies, which include the United States, Japan, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, New Zealand, these Peru and Chile, you take these countries together, and they are, I think, 40% of the world's GDP and 25% of world trade.
Yes.
And they are now going to form, it looks like, a trade arrangement all around China. How is China reacting to that, and how does that affect China-Japan relations?
Well, sitting in Washington, watching the conversation on the Trade Promotion Authority, on TPA, which is the Congress giving the president permission, right, to negotiate on Americans' behalf, right, which is absolutely crucial for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, as Jeff pointed out, is this 12-member multilateral initiative. I bite my fingers every time it comes up. I support it as part of our larger rebalance to Asia. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, I think you've got to look outwards at Asia and our economic relationship there. I think it's going to be very positive overall, not only for the 12 countries, but really for the United States and particularly for Japan. U.S.-Japan have led in many ways in a bilateral negotiations. They've led some of the stickier issues on market access. I think agricultural market access into the Japanese market. We're not the only ones with interests in the ag market in Japan. The Australians, New Zealanders also have very high interest in opening the Japanese ag market. The Japanese want to see us reduce our tariffs on trucks in particular. You know, of course, that many Japanese automakers actually build their cars as well as their trucks in the United States, but there's still a residual high tariff on trucks, and so that's been a very sticky negotiating point for the Obama administration. Ultimately, though, for Japan is very committed to the TPP. It wants to see this notion of a high standards trade agreement leading trade liberalization in the region. They want to do it in partnership. So if you were sitting in Washington during previous trade negotiations with Japan, the bilaterals, very sticky, very difficult efforts at opening the Japanese market, this is a very different story. So the Japanese are fully committed, and they're very, very anxious to see this move forward.
So Japan sees some geopolitical benefits in the sense that you could set a new standard to which China and other nations in that region would try and align themselves ultimately.
But it's also deeply, we mentioned very briefly Abenomics. It's a big part of the leverage that the LDP, Mr. Abe's party, sees in opening the Japanese economy, making the Japanese economy more competitive. So it has a geostrategic impact, as you suggested, in positioning Japan better in the region, but it also has a real leverage for him in trying to push forward some of the domestic reforms that he wants to see. And already their ag reforms have accelerated as a result of his commitment to TPP.
Yep. Now, a couple of members of the audience, listening to all of these areas in which there is some tension, some jostling, some jockeying between the two nations, saying, how do they see this? Do they see this ultimately as moving towards zero sum again, that your success is my loss? Or are they trying to do what the United States has said it wants to do with China, and China said it's wanted to do with the United States, which is have a new kind of major powers relationship, one in which we rise together and find ways to accommodate our relative interests, but not make one success the other's loss.
So by they, I think we're talking about the Japanese
Yes.
policymakers, right?
Yes.
There has been a long-standing effort by Japan and China to overcome their past, to build a closer relationship, largely based on the strategy of deepening economic engagement with each other. And I don't think that has gone away. So Japanese policymakers understand that that's their biggest neighbor. It is the most dynamic economy in the region.
Yeah.
It is the center of this dynamism of the Asia Pacific. You may find that some will argue that Japan ought to try and compete with China, but that's a minority voice. Honestly, I think there's a deep realism about Beijing's place in the future of Asia. I think what the challenge for most Japanese as they look out at China is they're not quite sure yet what kind of China is coming. Yeah. They understand there's a more powerful China coming, that's clear. But is it a China that's really going to be hostile to Japan? And in the last several years, of course, there's been a lot of rhetoric coming out of Beijing that we've all heard in editorials and op-eds in the Washington Post, in the London newspapers. There's been some fairly strong language in the United Nations about Japan's past and about the nationalism and the revisionism of the Japanese leadership. So there's a bit of a rhetorical war going on between both sides about who is the right partner for the United States in Asia, right? And it's a normative debate. And I think the Japanese feel very sensitive about that because they feel that, look, the last 70 years we had this close relationship with you and now you're turning on us. So I think there's a little bit of concern about just how Beijing wants this relationship to proceed. And if Beijing might see this as a zero-sum game. So I think you'll see, and again, I read a lot of the press and the not the policymakers, but the kind of some of the opinion leaders in Japan, and you'll see some opinion leaders in Japan who are quite antagonistic towards China. A decade ago, you wouldn't have heard that so much. Very skeptical about what the ultimate ambitions of Beijing are in the region and whether or not Japan and China can really find a comfortable accommodation given this power shift.
Well, you know, that is one of the questions, because I get the same sense, which is that Japan would be comfortable being number 2 in East Asia as long as they thought number 1 was going to behave itself in a generous and collaborative fashion.
Right.
And one of the issues is then what does it say about the kinds of provocations that have happened recently? The building up of islands in the South China Sea, the establishment of an exclusive air defense identification zone. What do those say to Japan about how China will act, you know, as its rise continues and eventually eclipses Japan as a force in the world?
Well, there's 2 pieces. Specific to Japan, of course, the U.S.-Japan alliance has been the primary means by which Japan has pursued its security. So when you get into looking at the military balance, the regional military balance, including that ADIZ and the way in which China may opt to enforce it, the Japanese are actually quite worried about the U.S. ability to fulfill its commitments. So the alliance itself comes into question. But the larger question, I think, for most Japanese is really whether or not China is going to assert a different set of norms. Whether is China going to act in a cooperative way with ASEAN? Of course, the Chinese and ASEAN have been discussing a maritime code of conduct for over a decade now. And that code of conduct was largely about disputes in the South China Sea. So the accelerated building, the reclamation projects in the South China Sea, of course, raised some serious questions about the code of conduct with the ASEAN countries. So as you look out, and it's not just from Tokyo, it's from other capitals around Asia, the question really is, are there going to be new rules of the road? And are they really going to not be collaborative, but really demonstrate that this is a China that wants to assert its boundaries? The South China Sea, as you know, is a place where the Chinese feel that their interests were really pushed back during the 20th century. And I think it has, if you talk to Chinese policymakers about East China Sea island disputes or maritime disputes, that's one thing. When you talk about the South China Sea, that's traditionally where China belongs. That is China's sea. And I think the way in which they're going about this relationship with their Southeast Asian neighbors indicates that the more collaborative approach is not the approach they're going to take when their interests are really at stake.
Now, is that creating an opportunity for Japan? Is Japan reaching out to some of these ASEAN countries, and just as it's reaching out to the U.S. and saying, look, we have some new common interests here in terms of establishing rule of law and exclusive economic zones and maintaining a certain form of maritime security.
So you see that particularly with the maritime powers of ASEAN. So not all of the 10 ASEAN nations, of course, have maritime boundaries. Not all of them have the same opinions on this subject, right? But the Philippines, Vietnam, to name a few, have had a lot of diplomatic interaction with Japan in the last several years. Japan has agreed to provide old Coast Guard vessels to both the Philippines and the Vietnamese, and also to have Coast Guard to Coast Guard training and capacity building for coastal defenses. You see also India and Japan have developed a very strong strategic dialogue, which includes not only maritime forces, but also air and ground forces. So they have a very open conversation with India. And again, it's not just in the east part of Asia, but all the way through those Malacca Straits and up around South Asia into the Gulf of Hormuz that the Japanese interests lie. Oil comes from out of the Gulf of Hormuz all the way around through the Straits of Malacca and up. So if you begin to see a different maritime balance, if you begin to see, and this is an if, I'm not sure we're there yet, but if you were to see a China that wanted to contest a little bit, how those sea lanes were managed. Then, of course, the Japanese interests would be deeply engaged, and there are other partners around East and South Asia that would be natural partners for the Japanese.
Now, how does China read that? Does China read that as Japan doing what one would naturally do, which is form new relationships as circumstances change, or do they see it as part of a broader containment strategy that they've been expressing fear of in the region?
I suspect that we shouldn't give China one voice. I think in the foreign policy expert community that I interact with, which is both government and out of government foreign policy experts, you get a variety of voices on that. You get the containment school,
right.
Which is the United States and its allies are simply trying to contain China, and that China's rise has a peaceful intent. It has done nothing to make any of its neighbors worried about use of force or anything like that, and yet the United States continues, especially in the rebalance or the pivot, to try to contain China. So It's usually us that's leading the containment, not the Japanese.
Yeah.
But there is that voice in China, and if you read Xinhua or you read any of the press on that, you'll hear it quite obviously. But there are others who recognize that it's very complicated. And I don't know that they say it's easy, they just say it's complicated because the interests of the United States and other countries to the east China will always run up against those interests, and instead China should look towards Europe. And so you see a new development of a new Silk Road strategy by the Chinese, so that it looks back to a little different traditional way in which the Chinese pursued their strategic interests. So I think there's a little dialogue in Chinese foreign policy at the moment.
Well, what you describe is a very nuanced set of moves, and our strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China has reflected the same thing. A lot of very nuanced, thoughtful moves, and a lot of agreement, and a lot of progress, and yet the media tends to get drawn to the most provocative voices. Do you think the U.S. public and some of our political leaders are potentially creating problems that don't exist by misreading China, Japan's intentions, or drawing too quickly on the influence of people who don't really have influence in their countries?
I think that we've gotten very comfortable with this shorthand. I use this phrase, the shorthand of China's rise. It is a complex process. It will be a prolonged process. I don't think it invites a confrontation versus accommodation response. It will require that kind of sophistication, and it will require a steady commitment, I think, not only by the United States, but by Japan and all of China's neighbors, to negotiate their interests with this emerging China. At times, we're going to have to guess about who this emerging China is internally. We have, I'm not the China expert in terms of China's domestic politics, but we could very easily spend another hour talking about the various voices that are beginning to hold sway over Chinese foreign policy and the debate inside China. But this emerging China internally has a lot of challenges, but it also has a lot of stakes and interest groups at the table that will shape the way it responds. So I think we're all going to be in for a very tough and challenging, let's just say, future in the Asia Pacific, but it is where America's long-term interests lie, and therefore we have to be very sophisticated about the way we think about. And so when I wrote this book in particular, it was not necessarily to say what Japan has gone through, America will go through too, but to put a little texture on this phenomenon that we're thinking of as China's rise. Geostrategic change is not something that happens out there. It's about what we buy, it's about how we think about our relationships internally in this country. It's about where we want to and how we feel comfortable asserting our interests globally. It does not allow for an America that sits back and doesn't engage. It certainly doesn't allow for an America that doesn't steep itself in what's happening in Asia. We're going to have to be smarter, and we're going to have to be more engaged and perhaps a little bit more tolerant. But I think it's going to be an interesting decade or two as this shift takes place.
Now, one of our audience members asked you if you would cite China's rise as the primary factor in the push for Japanese military normalization. That is Japan thinking, in the event that there were a challenge in this region, we need to be in a position where we can be a force multiplier, and we don't currently have that capacity?
If I take you inside Japan for just a second, looking out, right, the contingencies that the Japanese always thought they'd have to deal with, when would war come to the shores of Japan, were always over there. They were always a Korean peninsula or perhaps a Taiwan Straits contingency, right? Of course, there's always the nuclear, standoff at the top of all this. But in real planning terms, these were the kinds of contingencies that Japan planned for, and they planned to play a supporting role in a U.S. strategy, right? Today, the island dispute has alerted Japan that it may be on the front line of a use of force incident. Maybe not a full-scale invasion or a brutal war, but something that could escalate out of control. So you're looking at a Japan that's grappling with what are the instrumentalities that they have, and how do they bring them to bear. Part of it, and I think you can see a lot of what Mr. Abe has done, is to make sure that the alliance functions properly. And so that means making sure that Americans still think that Japan will be a good ally to them. So part of the constitutional reinterpretation, and I think you'd get a pretty uniform argument across the board in Tokyo, that this is actually because we need the alliance to work effectively. And there's 50,000 men and women in uniform from the United States on Japanese soil, and we cannot say to those Americans, we can't help you if you are attacked on the open ocean. We can't help you if you are too far away from our own borders. Right. So I think it is a Japan that's trying to transform. I don't think it's in a militaristic direction, frankly, but it is a tug and pull with the support of the Japanese people. And if you watch the debate in Tokyo today, it's not very clear that Mr. Abe is going to move the needle all that fast and furious in that direction.
Yeah. Well, Japan already has a very capable Navy.
Has a very capable Navy. Yeah.
People don't necessarily appreciate that it's probably more capable at the moment. The question is the trend lines and how they are going to address that changing trend line.
To your questioners, though, I would say be alert to the fact that I think that Japanese Navy now is beginning to see that joint patrols with the United States, perhaps potentially with ASEAN navies, perhaps even potentially with India, joint patrols of the sea lanes of communication would very much be in Japanese interest. So I would expect, especially the maritime side, you should expect to see them pushing a little harder for cooperation with their neighbors.
Someone apparently wants to test both of our expertise on Australia. So how does Australia figure into the relations, trade, military, diplomacy between China and Japan?
Well, you probably can correct me on everything I'm about to say since you're the ambassador. Would you like to go first?
No, please.
So the Japanese piece of the puzzle, let's put it that way. Japan, Australia, and the United States begun a trilateral security dialogue 8 years ago?
Yes.
Something like 8 years ago. That very quickly morphed into a bilateral Japan-Australia conversation. And today, I think one of the strongest security partners of Japan in the region is Australia. Prime Minister Abbott also, we call it a bromance at the Council on Foreign Relations, has a good personal relationship with Mr. Abe. Mr. Abe relaxed the restrictions on defense technology exports, and one of the first customers knocking at the door was Australia. Australia would very much like to invite the Japanese to sell them their submarine technology, conventional submarines, which the Japanese are very good at, by the way. So this is a burgeoning security relationship, both in terms of operational exercises, conceptually thinking about the maritime issues of Asia, but also now increasingly in terms of Australia's own defenses.
Now, a lot of times I think when people hear about countries exercising together, they worry that that means that this is leading in a bad direction. But in fact, a lot of times it's intended to do just the opposite, to create more cooperation and to avoid miscommunications at sea, to allow countries to better understand each other's intentions, capabilities, and know the person to call when a situation happens on the open seas in order to de-escalate and avoid misunderstanding. And my sense is that both Australia and Japan and the United States, so that wouldn't be both, but all three have been making outreach to China to do more exercises together for that purpose. How is that working for Japan?
Well, it's interesting. The U.S., China, and Australia had an exercise a couple of years ago that the Australians had talked to me about, which I thought was very interesting. And they took some of the PLA commanders out to the outback to wrestle with some crocodiles and do some special forces training. But we don't think
They
of
make
that
ambassadors do that too. It was,
Did you?
yes.
There you go.
Show the
That's
scars afterwards.
part of what the Australians
Good
like
we're
to
on
make
radio.
sure you can do, right? So there's all kinds of ways. So C-cubed-I, which is a nice acronym for, for command and control and intelligence kind of interactions. Not the highly secret stuff. They don't share secrets, but they certainly talk to each other. So you have a lot of military-to-military dialogue and arms open to the Chinese at the moment. And the Chinese are actually becoming much more forthright in also putting their arms open to us, to show us things, to talk to us about how they organize their forces. One of the newest aspects of the SNED talks that we were just having in Washington is a new strategy dialogue between United States and China. And that really talks very specifically about strategic interests in the Asia Pacific and includes their highest level uniformed personnel. So the United States is probably taking the lead in some of this transparency and trying to build trust and systematically open up a dialogue about how do you conceive of your defensive posture? What is the role of nuclear weapons in your strategy? How do you see maritime stability in Asia, et cetera? The Australians, though, have long had a leader training course that included the leaders of the PLA in a regional context. So the Australians have done an awful lot on humanitarian disaster relief in particular with the Chinese, and the Japanese have too. The tensions in the bilateral Japan-China relationship, though, have basically forestalled their military-to-military dialogue for a little while. So we hope that that'll get back on track.
We have talked a lot about the Navy. We've talked a lot about maritime security. We've talked a lot about the islands and what they represent, and it seems as though that is one of the real thorns in the relationship. So, Don, one of our audience members, has asked the question: how would you solve that? How would you, if you were the person negotiating the relationship between China and Japan, how would you solve the Senkaku Island dispute, considering the history, doing it in a fair way? What would you give to whom?
So there's two ways to think about the island dispute. One is managing it and one is resolving it. And I think given the escalation in tensions and given the popular sensitivities that we find in both countries today, probably resolution is not going to proceed. So I'll give you not whether that's a should, maybe they should resolve it, but I don't think it's likely. The International Court of Justice offers a place to go for all countries that have sovereignty disputes. Japan has quietly said it would be willing to go. I think the Japanese feel very confident that they would win. So that the Chinese, on the other hand, have not been confident in the International Court of Justice. It's not yet part of what the Chinese government embraces. I don't know that they've seen that as a venue for any other kind of territorial dispute, not just with the Japanese, but with others as well. So the Chinese history, if you look at territorial disputes, the Chinese have actually negotiated most of their territorial disputes, be it with India, be it with the Russians, right? So it's not that the Chinese don't compromise on territory. They have. There's a lot of cases. Taylor Fravel, who's at MIT, has written a wonderful book on this, in fact. Not maritime, but land-based. So the Chinese are not impervious to getting rid of the problem if it serves a larger interest. So I think we should not rule out resolution. I suspect it will need to be bilaterally negotiated to be comfortable with China, right? Rather than under the UN ICJ framework. Nonetheless, that's third-party dispute mediation, rather. I think management is the most likely scenario, in which case you go back to a bilateral management, that the two countries find some new status quo that they're willing to accept. We may sit here 10 years from now and have this conversation, and the two Coast Guards are still circling around those islands. That may be the new status quo. And the two governments have a risk reduction mechanism. They have a basic understanding of what constitutes risky and unacceptable behavior, and that's become the way they now manage the problem. That's a little bit less acceptable, but it's a new management structure. But I think what we're grappling with right now is what the two countries can bring to bear politically that will be acceptable back home. So I wouldn't hold your breath that we're going to have something signed, sealed, delivered tomorrow. We have crisis communications, right? In case something happens. emails, business cards, who do you call, right?
Yeah.
Pick up the hotline if there's a problem. There is a risk reduction mechanism being discussed. The two Coast Guards have met. Other branches of government have met. We may see some framework that emerges from that. Not sure yet. But we may see another incident. And that's what I worry about, that we see another incident that then escalates it even further than what we've already seen. So I would like to see third-party mediation and a final resolution to answer, is it Doug's question? I think politically, politically less likely. I think you're going to have a management structure. It may be evolving. It may be somewhat vulnerable to future incidents and risk. But that's as close as we're going to get.
So, Dr. Sheila Smith, we have 1 minute left
Yes.
here with the World Affairs Council, and one more optimistic thing. We just talked about you're going to resolve the Senkaku Islands dispute for us all. How about food safety and working conditions? Do you see prospects down the road for some kind of treaty, some kind of trade agreement, maybe multi-party, maybe bilateral, but something that brings the two countries closer together on those terms as well?
I do, and I think that's one of the places where you see the most promise, in fact, because lots of countries have problems with regulation of food supply. The end of the chapter that I wrote on food safety, I ended on this ironic note that it was the Chinese that began to refuse Japanese food, and do you know why? It's because of the radiation after 2011, the nuclear meltdowns. So all countries need a global standard of judging the safety of food. And I think that's something the United States can play, obviously, a key role in. Our Department of Agriculture is very effective in trying to negotiate that, but we don't have a global treaty that talks about specific incidents. For example, radiation levels, what's acceptable or not. We just don't have it. And so in the world that we live in today, where our food supply in the United States may not be wholly dependent on other countries, but it is increasingly interdependent. I think the United States has a great incentive to become a part of the lead in that. So I think there's lots of ways those kinds of problems can be better managed.
And that's a great place to end, which we're talking about intimate rivals, and I think your point is that the world's becoming a more intimate place. The
Yes,
U.S.
it
is
is.
getting closer to Japan and China, and we're all getting closer to one another, and we've got to work out our differences. So thank you, Dr. Sheila Smith, for a great presentation, and thank you to our audience for asking such great questions and being so attentive.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure.